Shalom, this is Hakam ben-Emmett again with another Torah-centered video offered exclusively to my own company, the Torah Watchman Show International. We're going to talk about what was the past need for animal sacrifices during the time of ancient Israel, namely in the time of Moshe and the Kohen Gadol, Aaron, his brother. The primary Hebrew word for sacrifice is Korban, which literally means something that draws near or an offering that leads to atonement. Okay? The word sacrifice is the English direct word from Korban, and it's widely misunderstood about Christians because they think that the sacrifices of ancient Israel, per se, were for all sins, but the Korban, the primary purpose of that was to draw the Jewish people closer to God. Just remember that. And I would say 98% of all those sacrifices, some of which included grain, okay, and even given forth for yourself with like a half shekel, the building of the Mishkan, or a tithe or something like that, you know, that was considered something you gave up from yourself to draw closer to God. And that's a form of atonement, atoning for yourself, okay? Now I'm going to define some terms. Korban is the most common and general term for sacrifice, and it emphasizes the act of bringing something, the sacrifice, nearer to God. Literally, the bullocks, goats, and lamb, sheep, and everything was the four-horned altar. I like to call it the ascension altar. You see it predominantly before the Mishkan, inside of the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, that kind of area is very predominant. And they lift up these animals and they sacrifice on top of that. Okay. And then literally you bring it close to God because in the flame, the smoke, God would literally, you know, metaphysically said he would smell the odor and it would be sweet and pleasing to him. Now, the plural form of korban is korbanot, and it's used to refer to a group of sacrifices collectively. Okay, every Jewish holiday, every high holiday is distinguished among the Hebrew calendar by a certain number of animals and types of animals, including grain sacrifices. Grain offering, things like this, wheat and barley, unleavened bread, that kind of thing. That was also given as a form of atonement and sacrifice, and the korbanot. Now, the word Zevach, while Korban is a general term, the operative or actionable term is Zevach, which can be used specifically to refer to the actual slaughter of the offerings with a kosher blade or knife, or the sacrifice involving the killing of the animals. Okay, the animals were selected for animals offerings to God, namely. People brought their own animals to the altar for the priests to administer on their behalf, to atone for their incidental sin. 98% of all the need for Korbanot, it was for incidental sins, not the kind of sins you think about as murder and homicide and that kind of thing. These things were just mistakes that people made, or the rules of cleanliness, and there also were offered widely for being thankful for gifts and just appreciation and things of that nature. And it was a public witness before a tribal Israel of approximately 2 million or so souls. The word samaka, the term refers to the act of a priest placing his hands on the head of the sacrificial animal before the offering. Just picture this, symbolically transferring sins unto the animal on behalf of the people, as is described in the Jewish Bible. So literally, think about the word transmute is that you're actually taking something in a way from A to B, from object A to B, you're transmuting, taking that and bring it over to something else to be received on the distant end. So literally, if you think about Yom Kippur and those kind of sacrifices, the Kohen Gadol priest literally would put his hand ceremonially on the head of the animal before it would be sacrificed to atone for the sins of the entire nation of Israel in some cases. And it would actually be transmuted from the people to the priest and to the animal that would be destroyed and then burned up as an offering to be accepted by God and the final atonement. Okay, just picture that. Now, Korbanot, the sacrifices in the desert. Throughout the Torah, especially in Exodus, the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, where you have all the mitzvahs and laws and rituals for Korbanot, we read many, many passages about sacrifices. Here's a quick summary. A group of people called the Kohanim, like Moshe's older brother, Aaron, these were the chief priests, the priestly line of Levites. They were the only ones allowed to make sacrifices to bring people close to God. In other words, these priests were the facilitators of that atonement of the Korbanot. Okay? The first Kohen, of course, was Aaron and his sons and his grandsons, like Pinchas. The Kohanim would make sacrifices for themselves because they had sins themselves. You think a righteous chief priest would not have any sin. Well, think about what sins are just misdeeds, minor transgressions, touching something you shouldn't have touched, walking in a desert, doing trade or collecting food and all that. You may walk on a skeleton or a femur or a leg bone or something like that, something dead. And there's always a reason there where the priest get an argument with your wife, your children, the negativity, just getting that off your chest. And it's a witness. It's a witness before God, but and your neighbors, all the nation. Can you imagine the humility of a chief priest, the people of Israel see them offering sacrifice on behalf of themselves and their family? Okay, and it could be for that so-called incidental sin, or it could be maybe a Thanksgiving, a type of atonement for the birth of another boy or daughter. Okay. Now, these sacrifices were called Korbanot, which is again the plural of Korban. The word Korban means something which draws close. The purpose was to bring people closer to God. That's why I'm repeating it to emphasize where I'm getting at. The sacrifices would be vain. The Korbanot would be in vain and useless if they never achieved the end goal and the whole reason for setting up in the first place is to bring the broken and the sinful or the confused people of Israel closer to God, closer to God. And at the end of the day, it was all about love. Yes, slaughtering those animals and judging those animals, giving them the death penalty per se, took the place of similar judgments carried on, they would normally be carried out against people for their mistakes, their issues in life, and their actual sins that they committed. And it was literally transmuted, all those sins of the nation of Israel, to the priest through his hand on the animal, and the animal was destroyed. And so were those sins, so were those misdeeds, so were all those things were removed from the memory of God. Now, the Kohanim would offer a Korbanot every day during the evening, morning, and afternoon services. That's why rabbinites believe we have 3 prayers a day. Haredi Jews have 2 major prayers a day sometimes, but we read prayers from Psalms like anyone else, and we say prayers when we eat and things like this, but 2 major prayers and Haredi Jews for the Shemas. Additionally, they would offer Korbanot on holidays, like I said, the hogs, the high holidays. Whenever someone was it a Kohen that would want to help the sacrifice of their own. So you had, let's say, the tribe of Ben-Emmett, the tribe of Shimon, tribe of Manasseh, and others that were not of the tribe of Levi. we taught the Torah, and the Moshe would teach them the laws of the Korbanot, and then they would bring these animals from their flock and from their herds, and they would bring it to the temple, to the tabernacle. And in King Solomon's the same thing. They would bring their animals or grain offerings too, and everything else, something that they had, their tenth per se, and they would bring it to the Levites to offer on their behalf, because only the Levites were allowed to interact with the infinite of God, and the actual burning and offering of the sacrifices. Now, the people may deliver the animals to them on their families, on behalf of their families. The Levites did this themselves. Now, there were three basic kinds of korbanot: animals, grain, and money. Yeah, shekel, money. Animals would be killed, grain would be burned, and the money would be donated to the priesthood. If you remember, and a few parshas ago, on the building and construction of the Mishkan in the desert, it cost money. The dyes, the gold, the silver, bronze, copper, all this thing, the spices and things of this nature, the wool, all of this, and to pay people to actually manufacture this, well, they needed a budget for it, project management per se. So God said, from the goodness of your heart, I want you to give a half a shekel to the priesthood in the building of your tabernacle for me. Okay? And you can read more about this in the book of Leviticus, chapter 5:11, chapter 5:18, and chapter 14, verse 21. The Kohanim were called those who were close to the eternal. Okay? Exodus chapter 19, verse 22, showing that their job offering, Korbanot, involved closing the distance, the gap, the gulf per se, between human beings and God. That gulf and gap and that distance occurred, of course, when Adam and Havilah committed that sin and broke God's commandment, and the judgment was that they were removed from the Garden of Eden, and they had their infinite lives were made corporal, and they would have to live off the land the rest of their lives. And they had a separation from God during that time versus Eden. If you think about Eden and the closeness that Adam and Havilah had, well, this is kind of closeness that God desired for tribal Israel back at the time of Moshe, leading up to King Solomon and King Hezekiah and some of the other righteous Judean kings. Now, the whole effort of the animal sacrifices, the need and purpose of that is to bring people closer to God. The priest helped facilitate that too. Okay? The whole point of it is God said, I want to dwell physically with you. And for me to be able to interface the heavenly world, his throne per se, the angelic beings, all of this, all these spiritual, holy, and pure things with an impure world, every grain of sand within a certain kilometer radius around the Mishkan had to be purified and clean. More importantly, every person, their mind and heart, had to be pure before God too. So God says, in order for me to dwell among you, in order for me to conjoin my heavenly domain and the infinite with the finite, with you, these animal sacrifices will be needed for that time. And get what I'm saying? Because today, when you go to Jerusalem and you see a destroyed temple, you see Jerusalem was rebuilt by the Roman Empire, was not built by Jewish hands, and you see 5 mosques on there. You see no indication there's anything holy at all. Now, Jews make once holy things holy again through prayer, like the Kotel or the Western Wall, where all Jews go there and pray. Every single Friday, every single Jewish holiday, thousands of Jews go there and pray. And they pray for the temple to be rebuilt and the coming of the Mashiach. Now, why sacrifice animals? Why do it at all? Well, Korbanot was used to draw people closer to God again. These are questions posed by Christians and Jews to the rabbis. that brought offerings of animals, grain, and money to the Kohanim. The Kohanim was to, in turn, would offer them as sacrifice to God. This, the main purpose was to use to connect the Jews to God. People gave up their prized possession, as a symbol of their dedication to God. In other words, the very best of their flock of sheep, they gave it over to God. The very best of their grapevine, or the bee husbandry, or produce, and other things like this, they would give that over to God, okay? So-called first fruits, they would always give that the very best to God. Why? This is all about love. Now, after the destruction of the temple, is where it gets hairy and confusing. And this comes to my conclusion. The year 70 CE, Jews stopped offering Korbanot. Now, instead, they began to offer prayers. The rabbis taught us, and rabbis, the rabbinates, the Talmudists, taught us that we can become closer to God with words of our mouths rather than the physical sacrifices or deeds. Nevertheless, they still based the Jewish evening, morning, and afternoon prayer services on the ancient rituals for offering of Korbanot. What I mean by that, they emulate it, literally. For instance, the incense altar, that Aaron and his sons and grandsons took care of, the frankincense and myrrh and other spices they put in there. Well, we're not in that temple construct anymore. Most Jews of the world are separate, or live outside of Israel by means of their own and the diaspora. So they literally count these. In the Siddur I read one time, you count each and every one of these spices. When you count them through your words, you're doing it according to the sages, is what they're saying. And it's pretty much like Dayano, it's good enough for me and good enough for God that I at least pretend to go through it. Instead of move to Israel, take over Temple Mount, Har HaBayit, and start cleansing that temple area from the filth and the shame that's there, from all the mosques, all the pagan worship, all the stuff, and cleaning Jerusalem, the city of David. Instead of doing that, they would rather stay in Germany, they would stay in America, Australia, Spain, France, every other country in the world. They'd rather stay there forever, generation, Lavador, generation after generation, to the Mashiach is announced and comes and said, why aren't you in Israel? I need you to be in Israel. But we were waiting on you, Messiah, Prince of King David. The Mashiach will not think stupid in this, folks. But that's what they say, and when they institute that in prayer, and it is tradition, it is lovely and beautiful, don't get me wrong, but it's not the real thing. But they think by emulating this through words that their sins are atoned for in the same way, and they think that draws them closer to God. That's something that they made themselves. More Jewish law and Jewish code. They made this up, and it's not in the Torah that you are to emulate this to words and prayer instead of being partakers of the animal sacrifice. Today, when we come together as a community to pray, we use the model of the Korbanot to guide us in prayer. We really are. It doesn't matter if you're conservative, Reform so much, and Cardi Jews, Chabadniks, Rabbinites, Orthodox Judaism, all of it. The Korbanot teaches that we have to give something up from ourselves in order to draw closer to God. They teach us that we can easier come close to God with the help of other people rather than by ourselves. And of course, it is greater than an individual. It takes a village to resolve these difficult problems. And they're right about this. And they teach us that prayer can be deeper when we use ancient rituals. In all the ways, the Korbanot still lead us to holiness today based on rabbinical opinion. I'm curious what you think about. And my roundtable conclusion here about the need of animal sacrifices back in the time of Moshe and the need to have it again. Consider who we are. We are corporeal beings. And the creation and Bereshit of Adam and Havilah, we were literally dirty clay models, per se, golem, of the earth. And we only were given sentience or some spark of the soul of God when God made us alive and animated us, okay? So what I'm saying, we have an animal instinctive nature to do wrong within us. Like getting into bar fights, let that negativity destroy your witness before your fellow Jew. All these negativity things that leads to war and disagreements, people having to go to jail, all the crime and everything else. This is animal based behavior that's allowed to propagate like a malignant cancer since the temple was destroyed in 70 CE. May say, ben-Emmett, what are you saying here? What I'm saying is that if you want God to come in your midst, like the picture I have in the back here, the tribal Israel, if you want that Shekinah glory and feel the energy and the heat and the magnetism of that, the electrical effect of the air, and all this, just use your imagination, so beautifully sweet, right? If you want God's soul to indwell himself in your community, in your homes, you want him to be there. And you want to just be close to those angelic beings and say, Kadosh, Kadosh, right? If you want to be part of that, then the corporal environment where God is choosing to anchor himself there has to be cleansed of all sin. Both your hands, your mind, and your heart, your deeds, everything. Everything. This is why God was teaching us how through our reproach, we were not approachable to God. And these animals allowed us to do that. These animals were symbols of our animalistic nature. And literally when that lamb or bullock or grain offering, whatever, pigeon, whatever went up into the flame before God, and God said it was good, and the odor was pleasing before him, as a sweet blessing before God. The reason why God accepted that Korbanot and that sacrifice and that atonement is because he looked in you and saw no more sin debt. Do I need sacrifices today to remove my sins? We could do tzedakah, we can give charity and things like that. And listen, that mandate and that commandment mitzvah was throughout the Torah to help the needy, to help the poor. When you harvest your crops, sabbatical years and everything, you're supposed to leave something in the fields for the poor. Are you doing that? Are you doing that? After you brought everything to market, are you still going and culling the fields and taking everything else to make you big, fat, and wealthy, right? This is what God is talking about. If you want God in your midst, we need to pray for animal sacrifice to be reinstituted in Israel as symbols of our animalistic instincts that need to be purged and destroyed forevermore and cleansed so we can be like Adam and Havla before the fall. That's where God wants to be. And we can obtain that ideal Eden-like worldview in our mind when we say our prayers per se, and we say a prayer in the morning. Some people say in the afternoon, even when you say those prayers, picture the Shekinah glory of God. Picture the ascension altar of God. Picture the other altars and the incense altar and other things, the holy holies. Picture all of this going on, and picture that it should draw us closer to God like a magnet, not like a moth to a flame. So this is what I have to say here. Why were animal sacrifices important in the time of Moshe? Why they're equally important for the future in the day of the Mashiach? It's symbols that God wants us to come closer to him, because one day God will dwell in the midst of every Jew on the planet when every Jew responds the Eliyahu shofar blast to all the four winds, come home, come home, come home to the mountain of Zion. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Can we say Baruch Yah? Shalom Aleichem. Now you hope you know a little bit more about Korbanot and why it's needed. And for vegans out there, you live in a fantasy. You live in a fantasy. I love you, Jews. I love you. But you live in a fantasy, and you've been in the diaspora way too long, and you're contaminated yourself with pagan ideas. That's pretty much it is. We need to get back to Israel, adopt tribal core values, Mishkan values, institute that in our families, and live righteously before our God. And let God dictate to us what reality is, not us making it up ourselves. Take care. Shalom Aleichem.
If you've enjoyed this program, please click like and subscribe.